Welcome to tonight's edition of Resistance TV. This evening we're discussing the Forgotten War in Yemen and the British government's decision to reinstitute arms sales to Saudi Arabia. We're joined this evening by an excellent panel comprising of Robert Carter, who's a journalist and a researcher, Stephen Bell, who's a campaigner for the Stop the War movement, and Amina Atiq, who's a writer, activist and performer. I wonder if I could perhaps start with you in relation to the British government's decision to reinstitute arms sales. Apparently the minister claimed it was safe to do so, and yet just a few days before that decision was taken, I understand that a number of children were killed in yet another Saudi airstrike. What's your take on the government's decision to reverse the moratorium on arms sales to Saudi Arabia?
Well, firstly, thank you for having me on, Chris. It's a pleasure to be here on my debut appearance for the channel. Obviously, the UK's role in the Yemen conflict is quite substantial, but a lot of people, particularly people who may not understand nuances and the actual goings on in Yemen and the actual conflict there, they may not realise just how extensive the UK role is. But looking at this latest development, which you've mentioned about the UK deciding that it will resume arms sales to the Saudi regime, despite internal investigation into whether or not the weapons actually are used unlawfully against civilian targets in that country. And of course, there's substantial evidence to say that they are. It's just it's the tip of the iceberg, really, when it comes to what the UK's role is. Ultimately, they are profiteering from this deadly conflict, a conflict which has been described as the world's worst man-made humanitarian catastrophe. The majority of civilian lives that are lost in Yemen are as a result of the Saudi-led coalition's bombing campaign. And of course, the UK throughout this conflict has not only supported the coalition's actions, but has also essentially given it the green light to continue the war. One point that I do want to make very, very clear tonight is that obviously Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, and the other coalition Arab partners who are engaging in the war in Yemen, whether it be the nationwide blockade and siege of the country or the actual bombing campaign itself, they are essentially just the attack dogs which are on the leash of greater Western imperialist powers, such as the government in Washington and also the government here in Downing Street. And the UK and the US could end the war very easily tomorrow if they wanted to. This is a point which I really wish to stress. And Yemenis themselves are also aware of this fact. They could end it tomorrow, but they choose not to, because they see it as far more profitable to sustain this lengthy conflict, which has been going on for over 5 years now, which appears to have no end in sight, despite the massive loss of life and also the ongoing famine and disease spread in that country, which is quite extensive as well. Even at the time of the coronavirus pandemic, you see that the war is actually escalating as we speak. Violence has returned and is escalating in a tit-for-tat retaliatory and aggressor strikes between Saudi Arabia's coalition and the Yemenis. And unfortunately, it's because these powers refuse to rein in the Saudi regime that the war actually continues. So, of course, I'm sure throughout the evening, Saudi Arabia will receive the brunt of condemnation from both us here and also viewers as well. But we really have to emphasize that the war in Yemen is given the green light by the UK, Washington as well. And ultimately, whilst these two imperialist powers continue to support Saudi Arabia, the war will continue, unfortunately. And so ultimately, we have to force a change here in London and also in Washington as well, if we want to see any change for Yemen, tangible change on the ground there.
Yeah, no, thank you. Amina, I mean, you've got a particular interest, obviously, in what's happening in Yemen. I understand that your mother is there right now. I wonder perhaps if you could give us your take on, and indeed, what sort of your mother is saying about some of the experiences that she's had there, and your thoughts about the government's decision to once again resume the arms sales.
Yeah, so last year on the 20th of June 2019, I was actually outside the Court of Appeal with campaign against the arms trade, and it was just really insightful and impressive to see so many young people who were part of this movement. And when I heard, a week ago that the government has announced that to resume the arms sale, and it was described as an isolated incident, it just shows you that it's more than just money. I think it's the power and the return of the British Empire, and some people might see this as like, that I'm.
Oh, we've lost your sound there. You've muted yourself momentarily. Oh, we've lost your sound, Amina. Can you hear us? We've lost Amina at the moment. Can you hear me, Amina? You need to unmute yourself, Amina. We've lost your audio completely. Perhaps if I go to Stephen while we try and get that sorted out. I don't know if Zahir can, our technical guru, can try and help sort out Amina's technical difficulties there. But Stephen, just in relation to the British involvement in Yemen and the RAF's involvement over there, and obviously this decision to resume arms sales. I mean, what's your thoughts about what the minister's reasons were for resuming the arms sales, and has Stop the War got a view in relation to the RAF's involvement out there?
Well, for a start off, I think that the British government could not wait to resume arms sales. Immediately, they made it clear, following the Court of Appeal decision, which Amina referred to, that they would challenge this. And so in terms of their preparedness to support the Saudis, they have demonstrated over the past 5 years, since March 2015, that they completely endorse the Saudi action, and that they wish to see a continuation of the war. In terms of their involvement, the British government has supported not just arms sales, it has supported the war itself through the exchange of intelligence, assisting with logistics. There are British personnel in the Saudi command center in Riyadh responsible and taking part in the targeting of the bombings in Yemen, and as well as the systematic training of the coalition armed forces. The British government is assisting in training the Navy, the Army and the Air Force of the coalition partners, and there is no real reservation in the British government's position. This is despite the fact that it is obvious that the war has failed, that the coalition cannot achieve a victory over the Yemeni resistance forces, and that the coalition itself is fracturing. Currently, they are pursuing different war aims. The Saudis are attempting to restore the previous government, the ex-President Hadi to government, whereas the United Arab Emirates are supporting the secessionist Southern Transitional Council, who do not wish to restore Hadi to government. So British government is not only supporting without reservation really this war, and it's making it possible, as Robert said, along with the Americans, but it is also ignoring its own rationale for the war. In theory, the British government supports the restoration of the Hadi government in Yemen, but in practice, it's allowing a war to take place within the coalition, and it's saying nothing about that. So I think it is a fiasco as far as British foreign policy goes, and there is no possibility of them making any military or political progress. That is why we have to condemn this decision to restore arms sales, which supposedly, as Amina said, was because the British government estimate that breaches of international humanitarian law by the coalition are merely incidental. Well, this week, after restoring arms sales, the Saudi coalition has killed children in Al-Jaf and in Hajjah government. So within a week, they have started committing war crimes again. So there is no justification for the restoration of arms, and there is no possibility that this war will end successfully for the British government or for the Saudi coalition.
Yes, indeed. Amina, have we got you back? Can we hear you now?
Yeah. Sorry,
technical difficulty. You were just talking, I think, about the imperialism of the British government and its involvement there. Do you want to just sort of pick up where you left off? And I don't know if you want to say a word or two about your mother as well, who, saying before we started, is actually over in Yemen right now.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not going to go into much detail because I do have an opinion on this, and I do feel like this is greater than us. Like Robert was saying, the war can end tomorrow. Every war ends. But I also believe this is another type of war that we don't actually have the ability to understand. And when a lot of people ask me, what can we do to understand? And I'm like, the first thing you need to do is support Yemeni activists and campaigners who are already doing the work. I see a lot of Yemeni activists who are doing some things on their own with no support by mainstream media. They're not getting the exposure that they need. And I just think if we could collaborate, like, for example, if we could collaborate with British Yemeni activists, with an American Yemeni activist, and collaborate, I think our forces will be a lot stronger. So my opinion on Saudi Arabia is very, very clear. And it became clear when they bombed the blind school in Sana'a. That's when it became really personal and really confusing. At the age of 20 or 21, I was thinking, is this a war against their enemy, or is this a war against the people of Yemen? And if it's a war against the people of Yemen, then this has become personal. And as a British citizen, watching Yemen being bombed from my British window, it is personal. And I've always said, and people say, this is so threatening. I mean, your language is threatening. But every person or every party that has been involved in this war, whether they are sitting on the sidelines, whether it's the UAE soldiers in Aden, or whether it's Saudi Arabia firing missiles from Riyadh, or the Houthis on the ground who are, hiring children soldiers, everyone will be held accountable. Because I think that and so about, as campaigners, sometimes we really have to bring ourselves back to why we're doing this, and this is for the people of Yemen. And I say this because a lot of Yemeni activists on the ground are not getting heard, and we really need to support the journalists who want to get their stories out, but they're being persecuted for telling the truth, whether it's by military forces or by the Houthi party. I'm not pro anyone in this war. I'm only pro-human. And we have to make this really, really clear, because you know what, Chris? This is not about me or you anymore, or this is not about Robert, or this is not about every activist. This is about the people of Yemen. And you know what? If the war was anywhere else in this world, I don't think it would have survived. The reason why people have survived, the Yemeni people have survived, because of their resistance, because they are people who resist, and they are known for this. And the war has not been 6 years. Yemen has been in war more than 60 years and plus. And sorry, I'm really passionate. It's been a long time that I've spoken about Yemen. There's a lot of fire. I'm frustrated and I'm angry. And I'm angry that the British government has resumed its arms sale and called it an isolated incident.
Yes,
and they should be held accountable. Every child's death, every starvation, every building that had been demolished, they should be held accountable. Because you know, when a Yemeni child picks up a fragment of a bomb, it says "Made in Britain." Well, I don't know if it says technically that, but poetically, it says "Made in Britain." So they don't remember Saudi Arabia; they remember Britain. And they will remember that, and children born in this war will remember that, and they will not forget. And my mother, I asked my mother, and she said, Amina, Yemen is not the same. Your summer holidays to Yemen is not the same. And she said, you're not going to see the same Yemen that you were born in, maybe for the next 50 years. And I was actually in Yemen 7 years ago. There was police officers that were killed right in Rada, and there was actually a police officer that was dragged onto our bus. That was 7 years ago. So when did the war begin? And I've got a question just to float out there, is if Saudi Arabia was not involved, would British media outlets really broadcast about Yemen? Would they really care? Because I think British media only, not all, but just to generalize, really broadcast about Saudi Arabia because it benefits the British government and the expansion of their Britishness.
Thanks, Amina, for that passionate introduction, and absolutely understand and share your passion. I wonder if I could turn to you, Robert. And Amina mentioned there the important role that journalists play, but Julian Assange was quite critical of many journalists for their collusion in lies about war, and he said that all wars are started through lies, and that the journalists that perpetuate those lies are equivalent of the war criminals in a sense. And he said that if wars can be started with lies, then peace can be started with truth. And obviously he was and is indeed a truth teller, and clearly that's why there's so much effort being put into silencing him. What's your thoughts about that, and the important role that journalists ought to be playing? And obviously you are a great exception in terms of your campaigning that you've undertaken on some of these important issues. What's your thoughts about that? I mean, and how can we kind of turn this around? I mean, it seems the mainstream media is a bit of a lost cause on issues like this in terms of getting the truth out.
Well, I think it's right to say that after politicians, the journalist community are probably quite unpopular with many in the general public right now, for obvious reasons, similar reasons, in fact, that politicians by and large are. The fact is that many journalists are not seen as truthful. They're seen to be essentially promoting a particular viewpoint rather than actually bringing the actual truth and reality to the people. And obviously, all journalists have to take some responsibility for this. But where I draw the line between, say, me and other journalists is ultimately mainstream Western media has the monopoly on the particular viewpoint which they wish to present to the majority of the general public. There is major censorship going on against alternative media sources or media platforms which bring a viewpoint which is not favorable or complementary of the Western standards. So, for example, you'll find that RT, which is the Russian channel, or indeed Press TV, which represents the Iranian viewpoint, they will be censored by, say, Ofcom in Britain. for saying or doing something which Ofcom deems to be unacceptable. But then the BBC, on the other hand, which is essentially the state mouthpiece for Westminster, they will not be held to the same standards or criticized in the same way whatsoever. In fact, they're put on a pedestal as if they are completely impartial. Everything they say and do is totally fine and acceptable, and they're abiding by all standards when it comes to journalism. So there's a degree of falsehood here where we are spoon-fed a narrative which the BBC will feed us. And we saw this very much, you'll know very well from personal experience, with the Labour leadership under Jeremy Corbyn, the first anti-imperialist left-wing politician to lead the opposition and get very close to taking hold of number 10 Downing Street. He received huge onslaught of unfair criticism, condemnation at certain points, and coverage from British and Western media sources. And ultimately, it contributed towards his downfall, you could argue. This type of coverage hasn't been given to Sir Keir Starmer, his replacement, who is clearly a man of the establishment. He's not anti-imperialist whatsoever. He's prepared to compromise, fall in line with mainstream narratives such as on the Israel-Palestine issue, the Kashmir issue, and also some domestic national issues as well, in terms of, I believe there's the trade union issue, the Black Lives Matter movement. He was the first opposition leader to condemn Black Lives Matter UK. I mean, and he's supposedly leading a party which has a rich history in anti-racism. So the bottom line is, my point, which I'm trying to say, is that do not fall for the lie that the mainstream Western media is is bringing you the wholehearted truth and nothing but the truth. In fact, you find quite often that they're bringing you the exact opposite. We need to break this narrative. We need to break this misconception that mainstream massive channels like the BBC, with all of their wealth and money and funding, are a source of information for the people. They're not. And indeed, this is why I enjoy appearing on alternative media platforms like Resistance TV and working for Press TV UK as well, is because we actually have a responsibility to bring the alternative viewpoints to the people. And indeed, on issues like Grenfell, the war in Yemen, and things like that, and foreign policy of the Western imperialist powers, we actually fall on the right side of history by and large. So it's very key that we continue to work together and to push and challenge these mainstream media narratives whenever possible.
Is your opinion that the mainstream media in this country, Robert, are censored by the government, by the Ministry of Defence and Foreign Office?
I think,
or do you think they just self-censorship, is it? Or a combination, perhaps?
It's a bit of a mix. I mean, we know from past exposés and information that's been brought to public attention that the BBC in the past has been censored by MI5. So if you wanted to work for the BBC as a journalist, there was a period not that long ago where your application would have been put through British intelligence services to vet you and essentially make sure that you were in line with British state viewpoints, particularly in terms of foreign policy and things like that. I think obviously there is a bias within the BBC and these other massive channels, but what they try to do is they try to make out there isn't. So ultimately, if the BBC was honest and said, look, we are a mouthpiece for the British state, they were pro-Iraq war at one point, for example, but they would claim that they weren't pro-Iraq war. They would claim that they were impartial. They're also pro-regime change in other instances, like we've seen their coverage on the Syrian conflict, for example, has been very unfavorable to one side and favorable to the other. So I think it's just
not just the BBC, Robert. That goes across all the broadcast media outlets, as far as I can see, and indeed on Venezuela, Latin American question. I've been on the receiving end of some hostile questioning from very partial presenters who actually had used to have quite a lot of time for, and I thought, on Channel 4 and not just the BBC. So, but yeah, I mean, I take your point about the BBC as given its sort of special status that it has, but I think many people in this country put the media on a sort of a pedestal, really, and I guess the rule of thumb probably should be to anybody who's interested in current affairs is to get your news sources from a variety of different places, really, and don't just sort of rely on the mainstream broadcast outlets. So I would suggest. I can see you nodding up, Robert, on that. It's probably fair comment. It is encouraging, of course, that there is the alternative media platforms that have been springing up, like ourselves, and obviously others that are more established that do give an alternative viewpoint. And I think that can only help. But perhaps if I could just move on to Stephen, and Stephen, just interesting, and perhaps picking up on the theme about lies that start wars. Julian Assange's case, and I've just got a quote in front of me here, Stephen, from the Conservative MP, Bob Stewart MP. I'm sure you're familiar with him, and apparently he's been out to Yemen, and he said that this is a quote from him: "Having spoken to the air controllers, which included Royal Air Force people, I was most impressed by their orders for opening fire. I spoke to the pilots, and they do not open fire unless they are guaranteed there are no innocents underneath." What do you make of that, Stephen?
I'm sure he's very comforted about that, but people are dying. Children are dying. As I said this week, we've had 2 important incidents whereby the Saudi coalition has killed children. Bob Stewart, along with many politicians in this country, want to be reassured. They are doing everything they can to hide what is actually going on. The British government, for example, refused to support an independent investigation into the allegations of war crimes by the Saudi coalition. Instead, they said they were satisfied with the Saudi regime's own investigations into these alleged incidents. Well, you are saying that you're satisfied with the criminal investigating their own crime. And obviously, this is an outrageous thing to do. Unfortunately, this is the position of the British government, and we have to organise widely and as far as we can to press the British government for a new policy. The fact is that the British government is supporting the war, just because of its relation with the Saudi regime and the UAE, but also because of its relationship with the United States. Particularly after Brexit, the British government is becoming more and more aligned with the United States foreign policy. And because the United States regards Iran as the primary problem in the Middle East, they therefore are forced to rely upon the Saudi regime. Rather than continuing process of dialogue and so on, they are supporting a variety of wars and covert operations in the region. The British government is assisting this in every way. The establishment of naval bases, new naval bases in Bahrain and Oman by the British government is part and parcel of pivoting behind the United States and the terrible slaughter and suffering that has been imposed upon Yemen would not, as Amina said to begin with, would not have been possible without the involvement of the British government and the United States. The Saudi Air Force has more British-made aeroplanes than the RAF, and it wouldn't be able to keep them in the sky if it wasn't for thousands of BAE staff working in Saudi Arabia. So this war, this terrible tragedy, could stop tomorrow if the British government and the American government says, enough, you're not going, the Saudi regime is not going anywhere. We need a new policy. We need a dialogue, an inclusive dialogue amongst the Yemenis, and withdraw the foreign forces, withdraw the UAE from all the ports that it's occupied, Socotra Island and elsewhere that's occupied in southern Yemen, withdraw the Saudi forces and allow the different forces, in political forces, Yemeni forces, an inclusive national dialogue to chart a way forward for Yemen itself. We have to fight for an end to the intervention.
Yes, and doesn't it indicate the power of the military-industrial complex that you know this war is allowed to continue, because clearly it's incredibly profitable, isn't it? I mean, do you think that's a fair assessment, Steve?
Well, it's fabulously profitable. I mean, the BAE has made something like £15 billion since 2015 just from arms sales to Saudi Arabia. It is fabulously profitable, and the arms dealers and the arms firms, the companies, will continue to sell this. It's necessary for politicians to take a stand. They don't have to be hostages to arms companies. They're allowing themselves to be hostages. Yeah. That's why it's very important. The type of opposition that you see that is represented here today, journalists like Robert, activists like Amina and myself and yourself, of course, we represent the alternative to the absolute moral cowardice of the British government in continuing to support this war. Therefore, it's very encouraging when you see young people, whether it's in Liverpool, London and elsewhere, going in the streets despite all the restrictions on political activity at this point, to say enough is enough, because far from rearming the Saudis, the British government should say, that's it, not a penny more, not a bullet more, not a missile more. You've had enough, you failed. There must now be a political solution.
Yes, no, indeed. And Amina, I don't know whether you've got any thoughts on that quotation from that I mentioned from the MP in the House of Commons, Bob Stewart, who claimed that when he spoke to the controllers at the Royal Air Force, that he was very impressed by their orders for opening fire, and he claims that he spoke to the pilots and they said that they do not open fire unless they are guaranteed there are no innocents underneath. And yet we know from the statistics that have been published that at least 18,000 civilians have been killed over the last few years. And you know, you have kind of hands-on experience. How do you respond to a comment like that from an MP who's spoken to those pilots who've given him this account? How does that relate to your experience and what you've heard from people in Yemen?
I don't know if you noticed, but I started smirking. As they say in Liverpool, it's an absolute joke. Because if you speak to Yemeni people on the ground, they will tell you that's an absolute lie. We're in contact personally, myself and so many activists in Liverpool, with doctors who are trying to keep hospitals on the ground, one of them being a Sabrine Children's Hospital, and yet missiles are still fired around the hospital, within the hospital. So public places are not protected, children are not protected, unless they've gone to the wrong opticians. They are firing deliberately. It's a deliberate war. It's a deliberate, like I said at the beginning, this is not a war against the enemy. This is a war against the people of Yemen. Yeah. And it has been clear. And as I said, 4 years ago, when I heard about the blind school was hit, even though the bomb did not go off, it was hit. It destroyed a public place that was used for children who were blind.
Yeah.
And their response was that the Houthis are using public places as their bases, or they're using hospitals or children. I don't know if you remember when that school, the school bus was hit.
Yes, I do. Yes.
I can never get that memory out of my head, because the
Yeah.
only thing that was left was US and UK fragments of bombs and school children's backpacks. That's the only thing that was left. And that is the reality. So if anyone makes that quote or says that again, you just tell them what happened when that bomb hit that school bus. Why did it hit the school bus, and why did it leave? I think it was about 12 children that had died.
Yes.
Because I think it is deliberate. And I think now, after 6 years, we need to accept that the UK government and their involvement is nothing to do about monitoring Saudi Arabia's intervention with Yemen. It is a collaboration, and we have to call it for what it is.
Well, look, as Julian Assange, just to keep quoting Julian about starting peace through truth, and obviously platforms like this try in our small way to get the truth out there. And just in relation to that, I mean, we've dubbed this the Forgotten War because there has not been the attention in the mainstream media that it deserves. And you, in your opening remarks, I think, Amina, mentioned supporting the activists on Yemen, the Yemeni activists. And I just wondered, maybe you could just tell viewers how they can go about getting involved and contacting some of the activists who are focusing on this issue, because it is so horrific. And I think if we could get this message out there, then, spread the word, as it were, that will then empower people to raise it with their, because I think people will be outraged, to kind of raise it with their parliamentarians and others and the powers that be, to say this is not good enough. You're our representatives, you're doing this in our name, and we say no. But I think we need to give people the information to be able to bring that pressure to bear. And clearly, the best place to start is those activists that you talked about.
Definitely.
So how do people get in touch with them, Amina?
Yeah. So so I come from a creative background. So when the war began in Yemen, I added about 2,000 Yemeni people on my Facebook, just strangers. And I said, if I want to know more about the war, the best people to know the information and the truth information is through the Yemeni people who are on the ground. And when I connected with so many activists, artists, journalists, honestly, the difference of what is exposed through their art or their work or their written work compared to what the BBC news outlet tells me, I knew there was a difference in narrative and who the story is for. And as art, I always believe, as well as politics is effective, I also think art is effective as well. Art speaks in different languages. And I've always, when I've gone to conferences about Yemen, I'm like, what about the artists? What about the writers that are being persecuted? They are as vital as any politician or anyone that's on the ground. They are the ones that are giving us authentic information. So the best way is we use social media. I mean, I think with lockdown, everyone's got social media now, haven't we? Is by connecting to Yemeni journalists. And it's really easy. A lot of Yemeni journalists speak Arabic and English. So the information now is in English. And they realize, and they've noticed in the last 6 years, that the barrier between the West and Yemen was language. Because when I was searching about Yemen, a lot of the things were in Arabic, and my Arabic is not that great. So I follow another organization called Botswana. I don't know if I'm pronouncing it right. They are a legal organization based in Yemen. So they've done a press release recently about people that have been imprisoned in Yemen without any release, and they've done an amazing animation about basically letting Yemeni people know their rights if they are detained. And I just think this is the way that we need to be supporting. People are already creating work. So the best way is to really, obviously, you're more than welcome to connect with me and I can connect you. But also do your own searches.
What's your Twitter handle, Amina? What's your Twitter handle in case people want to contact you?
It's Amina Atik Poetry. And the other thing is, also the female voice in the Yemen war. This is so important. Growing up in Britain, all we heard about is male war poets. We've never heard about the female war poets, did we? And that is the same thing right now within any war. We never really hear the female voice. But if you look at the women's role in Yemen, is honestly, it's absolutely amazing. They are the ones, without the women in Yemen right now, they're the ones that have held the country together.
Yeah.
They're the ones that have switched their gender roles into other jobs that they've never worked before. My mum said that so many of them have set up enterprises in their villages to make money to feed their children. And I think these are the people that we really need to be supporting, fundraising. One initiative, sorry, I talk a lot. I talk for England, don't I? But so
we got you on
just one last thing. One last thing. In Liverpool, we supported as Cyprian Hospital, and every month, I think for the last 3 years, we've been keeping the hospital running by fundraising every single month from Liverpool. This is one hospital, one city. So imagine if this was a big initiative where Leeds with one hospital, Birmingham, one hospital, we can really help the economy in Yemen and help hospitals get back on their feet, because 50% of medical facilities in Yemen and hospitals are not running anymore. But yeah, so this is one initiative. Honestly, anything is possible. And but yeah.
No, that's great. I mean, do you have a Facebook platform as well?
Yeah, but I talk a lot on that one, so I think Twitter is better because it gives me limitations to word character.
Yeah, no,
but I can share it.
Yeah, if you could. I mean, do you know what it is? So if you could just let us know, then
it's just Amina Atik.
On Facebook as well. Yeah. Oh, cool. Oh, excellent. Right. Yeah.
Oh, thank you, Chris.
No, indeed.
Let me just
come back to Robert actually, and just wanted to get your thoughts about Philip Hammond, who has apparently just accepted a role as an advisor to Saudi Arabia, former Chancellor of the Exchequer, which, an indication of that kind of revolving door between senior positions in government and then going into industry and into kind of lobbying in that sense. It's quite an interesting development, isn't it? What's your thoughts about that, Robert?
Very interesting, but it's not surprising because this type of thing, as you've already mentioned, has happened many times before. Tony Blair, for example, I believe he's started his own think tank organization, the Tony Blair Institute, something like that. He has been exposed for taking huge sums in payments from the Saudi regime for advisory roles. In fact, he, has the architect behind the horrific invasion of Iraq. It's hardly surprising that he would turn to another horrific regime in the region, such as Saudi Arabia, to receive a pay cut. Not only that, but there are other examples, particularly of the ruling Conservative Party, of having a stake, if you like, in the Saudi regime's aggressive behavior. Theresa May, her husband, who is a business owner himself, had investments. His company had a stake in the arms company, which actually sold the bomb which Saudi Arabia used in the airstrike which hit the children's bus in Yemen, which Amina mentioned earlier. I believe it was a 2018 strike which should have claimed around 40 children, something like that. It was quite a horrific incident, quite well known. An easy Google search would bring up the incident. Well, it was actually exposed later on after the strike that the Prime Minister of the time, Theresa May, had a direct link, a family link, to the arms firm that sold Saudi the bomb, which went on and killed those Yemeni children on the school bus. So ultimately, the relationship between the UK and Saudi is so intertwined that the blood of Yemeni children is literally on the hands of 10 Downing Street, is on the hands of this country. Britain is the Yemeni blood should be flowing through the streets of London as well, if you want to talk about it as symbolically speaking as possible. This country is literally directly responsible for mass murder and a genocide in Yemen. They may not be dropping the bombs themselves, but Saudi Arabia doesn't really have an army, if you think about it. The entire military apparatus has been built up and is sustained by the UK and the US, whether that be selling the actual equipment, the bombs, the aircraft, the naval vessels that are used by Saudi Arabia, or indeed, as you say, by army personnel going and training the Saudis. There's also been media reports that have exposed and highlighted that British military intelligence officials, commanders, military commanders are actually present in the command rooms within Saudi Arabia whilst they're planning airstrike operations inside Yemen, refueling of British aircraft as they're en route and things like that happens. The refueling of British sold Saudi aircraft whilst they're en route to conduct operations in Yemen are refueled by British Royal Air Force and also the US and things like that as well. So it's literally a joint effort. Although it's described as the Arab coalition that's attacking Yemen, it's literally a coalition which includes US and UK. That point has to be really, really stressed. Even, I think, as a final point from me, as an example, I have written down here, there was a Tory peer, Conservative peer, Lord Strathclyde. For anyone who doesn't know, again, a Google search would bring him up. He actually is the chairman of the UK arm of the Raytheon missile company, and they've made huge sums of money profiteering from selling arms to Saudi Arabia.
Do you know how much every time one of those missiles is fired? How much profit do they make? Have you got that statistic to hand, Robert?
Perhaps Stephen Bell could enlighten me on this. We're talking about hundreds of thousands, perhaps. We're talking about millions of pounds each time.
But you know, one of the things, just before I move on to Stephen, Robert, I used to raise these issues when I was an MP in the House and raise it on the floor, indeed raise it privately, and I would often, MPs would come back to me and say, well, but it's in Britain's strategic interest that Saudi Arabia, is strategic partner, crucially strategic partner for Britain and its efforts against terrorism and all these kind of excuses are trotted out. What would you say to that response to people when they're challenged about the carnage that Britain is essentially responsible for with these arms sales? When they say that Saudi, we need to do this because Saudi is a strategic partner and crucial that we keep strong diplomatic relations with them.
It's totally fine. I mean, if that's the UK position, that's the UK position. I obviously don't agree with it. The majority of the British public wouldn't agree with it if they knew the full extent of Britain's role in Yemen. I know they wouldn't. But at the end of the day, you can't claim to be a flag bearer of human rights and a moral compass and a true example of shining democracy on the world, but then also support undemocratic, genocidal, brutal regimes and dictatorships in other parts of the world whilst they're committing genocide and in profiteering from the mass slaughter of innocent civilians. So it's one or the other. But the UK, again, tries to do both. It tries to say this is a country which defends freedom of speech, human rights. It's a shining beacon. The UK claims that it promotes democracy internationally, but yet it is literally one of the key pillars that keeps the Saudi regime and other dictatorial, oppressive, tyrannical regimes alive and strong in the region. And indeed, many of them were actually installed by the British originally, including Saudi Arabia itself, which isn't a very old country, as you know. I won't go into the historical background, but it is fascinating. It is fascinating. A quick Google search will realize that Saudi Arabia is essentially a British colonialist project in the region, and its actions in the region ultimately represent British foreign policy. So all the genocide, murder, and tyranny that happens is a representation of British foreign policy.
Stephen, just on that point, in relation to that, Robert's response there, saying, well, if that's the UK position, but is it legitimately the UK's position? Because I think Robert also made the point about public opinion in that sense. And given that we're supposed to live in a democracy, I suspect that most people, if you told them what was actually happening in Yemen and what some of the brutality that the Saudi regime is responsible for its own people, let alone what's happening in Yemen, I suspect that the vast majority of people would not take that view. So, the UK view in reality is not the official UK view, is it? What's your thoughts about that?
British foreign policy is based on conventional hypocrisy. What the convention is that British documents and politicians all claim that they favour democracy, peace, freedom, all these splendid things. But British state interests mean that they deal with states such as the Saudis, who have none of these things. In Saudi Arabia, you can't be a member of an independent political party, you can't join a trade union, and so on and so on. There's no free speech, there's no right of assembly, and of course you cannot vote on your government in Saudi Arabia. And yet the British government continues a 100-year-long relationship with the same family in Saudi Arabia. And it claims, well, we know that the Saudis are repressive, but we talk to them and we raise our concerns. And this is where the hypocrisy comes in. They also know that the Saudi regime is not changing and will not change and does not care about British concerns, providing the British government continues to provide the Typhoon fighters, the missiles, and so on and so on. And that's the reality of British foreign policy. The same is true throughout the Gulf, where, for example, the British government has had a relationship with the same family in Oman for over 200 years, the same family in Bahrain for 200 years. And has it not noticed that these are dictatorships, that there is no progress towards peace, freedom, and democracy, all these other splendid things which apparently we're in favour of?
It's not really promoting democracy, is it?
Absolutely. It's promoting its relationship with a bunch of dictatorships.
Well, when we say its relationship, the relationship of the military-industrial complex, isn't it? And the kind of elites in society. It seems to me that the government is operating in the interests of a very narrow section of British society rather than Britain as a whole. But I wanted to just move on a little bit, if I may, Stephen, and come back on that point of view. But we've only got 5 minutes left now. But I just wanted, just in relation back to the military-industrial complex, because again, another argument which is often put, and in fact, next week on Resistance TV, we will be discussing the defence diversification and the arms trade. So please tune in next week and watch that. But what's your response from Stop the War to this assertion that the arms trade generates lots of skilled, high-tech, well-paid jobs, Stephen?
Well, it doesn't have to be only arms that we use our skills. It's entirely possible to plan and provide different products. This is a choice. This is a choice which the politicians endorse. Basically, the arms industry employs rather a small percentage of the workforce, but is phenomenally profitable because these are fabulously expensive machines which are being sold. And it is a choice to continue in this matter. I think that the whole point about the military-industrial complex is that it is a real thing. This is something feeding off of war, feeding off of human suffering. But that's not all of what the British ruling class does. I mean, they benefit from many features of the regimes in the Gulf, both in terms of politics and in terms of supporting other British industries. It's a decision however, to engage in this manner. And that is because the interests of small numbers of people, as you say, are deemed as more important than the interests of the majority. The majority of people in Britain have zero interest in seeing Yemenis slaughtered. Absolutely no interest whatsoever. Our interest is in a free Yemen, decided by the people of Yemen themselves, not subject to outside powers as it is at the moment. And so it's tiny, narrow interests, as you indicated, Chris, involved here. Our strategic interests is with friendship and equality with Yemen and the peoples of the Gulf, not with a series of royal cliques who are also dictators. No, we must have relations with the people. And at this point in time, that means defend the people of Yemen above all.
Yeah, no, thank you. We've got about 3 minutes left. Robert, there's a fair few questions come in from viewers, but we're probably not have time for one or two, maybe. A quick one, actually. I'll put them both out there, and then you can respond. I'll just ask each of you if you could maybe respond to them. This one is from somebody just goes by the name of Nige. He's saying, which MPs would you trust now to follow up any action? So who would you give a clean bill of health to, and it's worth kind of lobbying to actually take this issue forward? And then a question from Liz Robb, a bit more involved actually. She's saying, with Iran helping Yemen, and now China and Iran are getting closer economically and militarily, is this going to escalate? Because America will blow its top, as we all know. So any thoughts on that, Robert? And if you've got any thoughts about which MPs would be worth pursuing that might take this up as an important issue?
Well, obviously, the opposition parties tend to be a bit more favourable to taking up the Yemen cause, as they're ultimately prepared to hold the government to account. So usually Labour MPs, particularly the Muslim MPs, are quite hot on the Yemen issue. Zahra Sultana has already spoken out about Yemen this week, condemned the government for this latest report, which we've discussed today. So she's obviously very good on that. Even the SNP, the opposition Scottish party, they have spoken up for Yemen in the past to use it as a stick to beat the leading Tory government with. So usually opposition MPs, Jeremy Corbyn is still an elected representative and he's condemned Saudi Arabia many times. Yeah. So opposition, particularly the socialist MPs, tend to be more favourable, more willing to speak up for Yemen, from my experience.
On this other question, Robert, about a wider conflagration, I mean, escalation of leading to potentially a wider conflict, is that something that concerns you?
The situation in Yemen is so dire that a further escalation of conflict isn't so much a thing. Ultimately, we have already reached that stage, and the conflict is escalating as we speak. This week alone, in fact, today there was a Saudi strike which killed a number of civilians, and Yemen's resistance forces, their armed forces, have also vowed to continue retaliatory strikes. The last one, I believe, was on Monday, where they targeted several sites inside Saudi Arabia, and they vowed to do the same. So the fact is, we are at breaking point already. The conflict is all out. There are civilian casualties on a regular daily basis. So the situation can't really get any worse per se. But what we have to do now is ultimately force a change. And the problem is Saudi Arabia and their allies have made the situation in the ground so difficult that Yemeni forces, which traditionally would have come together and found a solution to their differences themselves, are not able to communicate and to solve the disputes via themselves. So I think the UN needs to do a heck of a lot more in order to create an environment where Yemenis can come together and sort the problems out themselves. But we need external non-Yemeni forces out of the country. And right now, I honestly do not see a scenario where, say, the UAE and Saudi Arabia are going to back off and let the Yemenis carry on. So it is very, very bleak situation. I can't stress enough. The Yemen crisis is a total crisis, a total man-made crisis. And I personally believe that the Yemenis have very little alternatives except to fight back, which they are doing. And so ultimately, I do support the Yemenis right to defend themselves from aggressors under international humanitarian law.
No. Thanks very much, Robert. Listen, we're out of time, but let me just give the last word to Amina. Any final closing comments or thoughts that you want to share with viewers before we close?
I just want to say, firstly, thank you so much for, the three of you for doing the work that you do. And one last thing, I want to say, sorry, just listening to you, I'm just getting quite emotional, because it is quite bleak, isn't it? The situation is bleak. And as I said at the beginning, everyone who is involved in this war will be held accountable. The Yemeni people are of the wise. They are people who believe in generosity. They are people who are, their nature is to forgive. But I don't think they will ever forget. So I'll leave it there.
No, thank you very much indeed. I mean, I really appreciate you taking the time and sharing your thoughts with us this evening. We've put, I believe, your contact details on the site. So anybody who's watching, if you go along to our Twitter feed or Facebook page or our website, you should be able to pick up Amina's contact details. And I think it's really important that we do everything we can to support the Yemeni activists, to kind of raise this issue up the political agenda. There are some good MPs who are raising this matter in the House, but we need more of them doing a lot more. So let me thank Robert Carter for his involvement this evening, Stephen Bell and Amina Atiq as well. Next week at the same time, if you could tune in, we have a discussion about the arms trade and defense diversification. We've got Hilary Wainwright, who has been doing a lot of work around defense diversification, and Kate Hudson from the Campaign for Nuclear Disarmament. So please join us next week at 7 o'clock, and thanks for watching this evening, and good night.